Right, let's make a start. I see a few references in the chat to the fact that it is Chinese New Year. Happy New Year to everybody. Right. In the previous lectures, we took a chronological approach, beginning with classical Greek and Latin writers through the Church Fathers and the medieval schoolmen to the Scottish Enlightenment. The next three lectures depart from this model somewhat, in large part because similar ideas tend to reappear, and it made more sense for me to put them together. So we will be meandering a little within the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I've titled today's lecture Cognitive Theories, but it might be more accurate to say that we will be talking about the cognitive elements or aspects of various theories that also contain other aspects or elements. Now, this is not a term that Tylor or Frazer or Jung or Freud wouldn't necessarily have used themselves, but one that I am retrospectively applying to them. I'm sure they will forgive me. The term and its complement comes from a branch of psychology called social cognitive psychology, which is, as it were, my own branch of psychology, which is to say the branch of psychology in which I trained. What social cognitive psychologists are primarily interested in is how people think about other people and groups and about their own relationships to these. In trying to explain human social cognition and behavior, we tend to distinguish between cognitive and motivational factors, and this example here might help. Consider the question, how did Emma achieve straight A stars at university? Perhaps Emma is just very clever, having great general intelligence, as cognitive scientists might say, and she would have excelled at any academic subject. Or perhaps she did not have exceptionally high IQ, but there was good fit in her chosen subject and her particular intellectual skills. Say she chose to do physics and happened to be very numerate. If she had chosen to do English Lit, she might not have done so well, not being as verbally articulate as she is good at manipulating numbers. And perhaps the exams were just at the right time of day for her. She's able to be alert and attentive in the mornings, but if the exams were in the afternoon or the evenings, she might have struggled more. These are all potential cognitive factors for Emma's success, as they are all about how Emma's mind processes information. But maybe Emma achieved straight A's because she worked really hard, motivated, and there's the key word, by her desire for a job in the aeronautics industry. Or maybe she was driven by her need to please her parents. Or maybe doing well academically just gives her an intense feeling of satisfaction and self-esteem. What these hypotheses have in common is that they feature some desire or need in the individual as an explanation for their behavior or some outcome. So this is the basic distinction for social psychologists. For most social psychological phenomena, there are bound to be cognitive and motivational factors underlying them. Emma's straight A's are in most cases attributable both to her intelligence and some desires. In this series of lectures, we will make a slightly different distinction, modifying motivation with function, which covers more ground. A functionalist theory is, just as the term suggests, one that posits that religion fulfills some function or confers some benefit upon adherents, and that this explains religion's origins and prevalence. These functions may be emotional or more broadly psychological, and if so, the overlap with motivation is significant. But it may also be social or cultural or evolutionary, which goes beyond the individual and her needs and desires. We will get to that, to these functionalist explanations next time. For now, let's consider the two main cognitive explanations of religion, both of which we have already seen somewhat, and usually even within the same theory. Intellectualism is the view that religious beliefs are pre-scientific causal inferences about the natural world. Lucretius and Hume had intellectualist elements in their theories. And anthropomorphism is, you might recall, the view that religious beliefs come from the human tendency, perhaps even an instinct, to attribute human traits to non-human things, including the forces of nature. Xenophanes provides the earliest example of such a theory, but the idea appears in almost everyone's theory. Both of these ideas are also to be found in E.B. Tylor's work, whom you might recall as the Victorian anthropologist who defined religion as belief in spiritual beings. True to this definition, Tylor's thesis was that at its most basic, religion is and began as what he called the doctrine of souls. That is, that physical objects have spiritual counterparts. Human beings are, as you might imagine, the most obvious case of this dualism. Tylor hypothesizes that people began believing in souls by first reflecting on death and dreams. We have seen this idea already in Lucretius, though he left it undeveloped. Tylor also obviously owes a great debt to Hume here and acknowledges as much. But his theory departs from both in two important respects. First, Tylor does not begin, as Hume certainly does, with gods, nor are external natural phenomena the mysteries which instigate human curiosity. It is internal phenomena, dreams and death, that inspire belief, not in gods first, but in souls. Second, and perhaps more significantly, fear plays no part in Tylor's account. Tylor imagines our forebears as scientists, or in his own words, savage philosophers. Our ancestors were not cowering in terror at thunder and lightning, but curious about the workings of their own minds. They notice that they are sometimes conscious, but not other times. They notice that the living and the dead look rather similar, but are obviously utterly different. They notice that people appear to them in dreams, and they wonder about these differences and these phenomena, and seek explanations for them to satisfy their intellectual curiosities. Their conclusion is that they, human beings, have souls. Souls make the difference between the living and the dead, and indeed the dead and the sleeping. Souls, detachable from bodies, also accounts for how other people, both strangers and friends, both living and dead, can appear to them in dreams and visions. This intellectual process is, for Tylor, no different from that engaged in by scientists, who also posit unobservable entities, infinitesimal physical particles and forces and laws of nature to explain observable phenomena. In this sense, Tylor gives more credit to our forebears than did Lucretius and Hume. Tylor does not stop at souls, of course. Once our ancestors possessed the idea of a human soul, they could posit souls for other things as well. In many cultures, this was not just animals, but plants too, and indeed things that we would now consider not alive in any way: mountains, stars, clouds, and so forth. Furthermore, from the idea that physical objects can have corresponding souls, it is not a large step, says Tylor, to the idea that souls can exist without corresponding bodies. And so the idea of purely spiritual beings can come about, including, of course, gods. Tylor's view can easily be summarized in the idea that religion is animism, exercised by a scientific mind before a scientific age. I said earlier that Tylor gave human beings more credit than his predecessors did. For a long time, and sometimes even now, this has been cause for criticism against his theory. There was and is probably a bit of racism going on in this criticism, really, especially when we consider Tylor's and his contemporaries' method, which still survives somewhat today. Their theories were historical ones about the origins of religion in the minds of our ancestors. But the term primitiveness is not synonymous with the word past for these theorists. They identified certain peoples which were in their time still considered primitive, especially those indigenous to the so-called New World. The prevailing methodological assumption about cultural evolution was that there is a trajectory from savagery to civilization, and that, for example, Native Americans and others were on one end and the British were on the other end. And so, to know what our ancestors were like, all we had to do was to look at what currently primitive peoples were like now, who are, for whatever reason, stuck in a state of arrested cultural development. This assumption is itself, of course, problematic. But Tylor also made a second assumption, this time not always shared by his contemporaries. Tylor believed in what he called the psychic unity of mankind, which is the idea that all peoples, regardless of the state of their societies, had fundamentally the same minds and the same mental capacities. Some cultures may well be inferior to other cultures, but this was not, for Tylor, because the human beings in those societies were themselves inferior. This proved too progressive for some of Tylor's critics. English Victorians may have been able to credit themselves with pure intellectual curiosity, untainted by terror and need, but could not quite bring themselves to imagine such a trait among the people they deemed savage and primitive. And so, very quickly, other scholars modified this theory. His most famous follower, inspired after having read his Primitive Culture, was James Frazer. Frazer's innovation was to pivot from science to technology, theory to practice. We can see this already in his definition of religion, which we discussed in our first lecture. He adds practice to his hero's single-minded focus on belief. For Frazer, contra Tylor, it was not theoretical curiosity about the workings of the human mind or of the cosmos that led people to believe in gods, but quite practical concerns. And it was not the doctrine of souls that provided the germ of all other religion. Rather, it was magic, which was also the application of a scientific mindset, or perhaps more accurately, a technological mindset. In this, Frazer buys into Tylor's psychic unity of mankind, which we have already said is a more progressive view than the scholarly consensus of the day, and certainly of their 18th century predecessors. So Frazer did believe that primitive peoples were capable of a kind of scientific thoughts. Where Frazer departs from Tylor is that Frazer did not think that our ancestors, or indeed the hunter-gatherers of his own day in far-flung places from his cozy rooms at Trinity College, Cambridge, had the luxury of speculating about the nature of things, preoccupied as they must have been with survival. Dispassionate intellectual curiosity was, in other words, the luxury of the wealthy and Western, not afforded to those in the Americas, Africa, or Australasia. Frazer speculates that our ancestors came to believe in two laws of nature, not unlike the laws of nature we now have, and both of these laws fit under the description sympathetic magic. Sympathetic magic is the idea that nature works by what Frazer calls influences, sympathies between things. The first law is that of imitative influences, or the idea that like affects like. The second law is that of contact or contagion. The idea here is that power can be transferred through touch. Voodoo magic provides a vivid example of both laws working simultaneously. Voodoo dolls are anthropomorphic objects. This comes from the first law of like affecting like. If you want to perform a spell on a person, you have to use an object that looks like a person. And voodoo dolls also very often require some material taken from the victim or the intended victim, hair or nail clippings, or even pieces of clothing. And this comes from the second law, the power of contact. Now, these laws turn, you will not be surprised to hear, not to be real laws, of course. Our ancestors were quite mistaken about what causal powers are operative in the world. But they do share with us, and with Frazer, the theory that causation does proceed by laws, which are available for us to discover scientifically. The laws of sympathy are thus analogous to our own laws of gravity or electromagnetism. Furthermore, it is not as though we are now exempt from ever positing false laws. In his own time, Frazer witnessed the overthrowing of Newtonian theories replaced by Einstein's new physics. Newton's laws are, we now think, basically wrong, despite the fact they are still very useful. So we are now well accustomed with the idea that scientific theories are always provisional, always waiting to be replaced or improved upon. Our ancestors, in contrast, Frazer thought, were not so forgiving of mistaken laws. Over time and experience, as their laws of sympathetic magic proved again and again to be mistaken, they grew weary and abandoned theorizing about laws altogether. They did not cling to their false laws, but nor did they persist in discovering truer laws. They sought a different kind of theory altogether, arriving upon the idea that the world is not governed by laws at all, but by persons, perhaps even persons as temperamental and unpredictable as themselves. This would account for the chaos in nature that anyone can see. There is a sense in which they did not totally abandon their belief in magic. Rather, they supposed that some other beings controlled the world by a magic unknown by and perhaps inaccessible and unavailable to mere mortals. These wielders of the true magic must have been very powerful indeed. And so these became gods. Frazer effectively turns Tylor's theory on its head here. For Tylor, animism is the natural beginning of religion. For Frazer, it is the reluctant conclusion of people who first sought scientific laws to govern nature, and only failing to discover the true laws, fall back on animism. But their ideas are clearly related to one another. Frazer acknowledges his debt to Tylor, and Tylor acknowledges his debt to Hume. Hume is less keen on attributing his ideas to others, but we can see clearly in Hume elements of Xenophanes and Lucretian, perhaps even of St. Paul. From Xenophanes comes the idea of anthropomorphism. From Lucretius comes the idea of a desire to explain and control the natural world, motivated by fear. From St. Paul also comes the idea of religious belief as inference from natural phenomena. By the 19th century, however, the canons of evidence had well and truly evolved from the days when scholars could get away with choice citations from the saints of yore, or if one's audience were not into saints, then classical sources revered since the Renaissance. What Hume started collecting information from this source and that, Tylor and Frazer epitomized, collecting vast numbers of examples from all around the world. Tylor's 1871 Primitive Culture was printed in 2 thick volumes, including much ethnographic and archaeological evidence. Frazer's magisterial work, The Golden Bough, dwarfed Tylor's. First published in 1890 in 2 volumes, it grew to 3 by 1900, and then expanded gradually until 1915, by which time they were 12. Tylor, and especially Frazer, may have had more data than Hume did, but the handling of data has been rightly criticized in recent decades. They can certainly be accused of cherry picking, and Frazer especially did doctor the evidence a little, tweaking the facts to fit his theory. More subtly, Frazer and Tylor both lumped things together that were only superficially similar. In a way, they can be accused of performing a sort of imitative magic themselves. And despite the increase in the amount of data, there were still significant evidential holes in their arguments. Their claims, you will recall, are both historical ones, and while they did have some evidence of previous beliefs and practices, chiefly from the classical and biblical worlds, most of their data were of foreign cultures of their own time, as I have mentioned earlier. The assumption, also already mentioned, was that hunter-gatherer cultures in Africa, the Americas, and Australia were so like ancestral cultures that observations of them were just as good as time traveling. This assumption is no longer really held in theory, though still often used in practice, and we certainly no longer use the term primitive in the way that our forebears did. Even around his own time, though, scholars pushed back against Frazer's chronology that placed magic before religion. All the evidence, even then, showed both coexisting at the same time. Some scholars even pointed out that in some cultures, monotheism may have existed before polytheism, which is obviously problematic for Tylor's theory, as well as for Hume's earlier. This latter claim remains contentious, though there is evidence for very early ideas of a supreme deity, for example, around Mongolia and in China. Whatever one makes of the details of these theories, intellectualism and anthropomorphism remain very influential to this day, as we shall see in the 5th lecture in a few weeks' time. But for now, let's turn to 2 figures who may well remain the most famous psychologists in the world, though they have lost their luster in university departments of psychology. Sigmund Freud's and Carl Jung's theories of religion are not really cognitive theories as such, but they do rely on their theories of cognitive architecture, or the structure of the mind. And so, before we look at their theories more fully in the next session, it would pay to consider their theories of the mind tonight. Now, I should say that I'm going to simplify Freud's and Jung's views quite a bit, and for the specific purposes of understanding their theories of religion. Both men revised their ideas several times over their careers without always admitting that they did so, and this makes it very difficult to pin down their definitive theory of the mind. What you will hear is a reasonable stab at it, but what I say is bound to generate disagreements among Freudian and Jungian scholars. Let's begin with Freud, as Jung's theory is a riff on Freud's. The basic distinction Freud makes is the one between the conscious and the unconscious. We're going to set aside that famous id-ego, superego distinction for now, as I don't think it's very useful for our purposes. The conscious is obvious enough. The unconscious, for Freud, is largely, if not quite exclusively, the home of repressed or otherwise hidden desires and memories. Repression is a psychological act, though not necessarily an act of the will. It is the process of taking objects in our consciousness and pushing them beneath our awareness to hide them even from ourselves. The classic examples of repression are traumatic memories on one hand and illicit desires on the other. In the 1980s, there were a bunch of cases of adults claiming that they were suddenly remembering, with the help of psychoanalysts, horrible memories of child abuse. In most of these cases, it turns out that no such abuse actually occurred, and that the so-called memories were products of suggestion instead by their analysts. We don't talk as much about repressed memories now as we did back then, but the language of repression lingers still in the zeitgeist, typically referring to sexual desires. We talk about people who are repressed, meaning that they have unexpressed sexual feelings. Now, according to Freud, it is possible and quite usual to have conflicting desires. And when these conflicting desires involve unconscious desires, either conflicting with one another or with other unconscious desires or with conscious ones, these can lead to neuroses that manifest themselves at the conscious level. Consider again our talk of sexually repressed people. We accuse people of being sexually repressed when we notice some odd behavior, perhaps of being harshly judgmental of others' sexual mores, perhaps of being vehemently homophobic. When we talk like this, we are, whether we know it or not, repeating Freud, such a strong hold he had and has in Anglo-American culture for such a long time and even now. Other Freudian tropes have survived. The psychoanalysts' couch, the interpretation of dreams, the tell me about your mother thing, and even the description of some people as being anal to mean rigid, which is a reference to one of Freud's psychosexual stages of development. But I digress. Neuroses are essentially anxious behaviors, the sorts of things people do when they feel put upon or nervous or insecure. They are almost always, in Freudian terms, maladaptive. And Freudian analysis tries to get to the source of these neuroses, the aforementioned hidden conflicts, to resolve them as a means of getting rid of the neuroses, which are just symptoms of these underlying conflicts. Now, we have been so far talking at the level of the individual and her hidden and conflicting desires, but Freud's view of the unconscious also includes contents somehow shared by all people, even inherited from our ancestors. There is, in other words, a collective component to the unconscious. And this is the space for intergenerational trauma, for example, and even ancient primordial trauma. As we shall see next week, this component is crucial for Freud's theory of religion. Jung's cognitive architecture is in some ways very similar to Freud's. From Freud, he took the idea of the conscious and the unconscious, and like Freud, he thinks that it contains desires and memories, including those shared by all human beings in the collective unconscious, which is really a Jungian term. However, repression plays a much smaller role for Jung than for Freud. Some desires simply begin and remain unconscious. They were never conscious in the first place, and so have never been repressed. And instead of just memories, Jung thought that there is a lot of knowledge in our unconscious, and specifically our collective unconscious. This is knowledge inherited from our ancestors. The familiar concept of instincts, as in maternal instincts or survival instincts and so forth, is related to this idea of inherited knowledge in the collective unconscious. Critical for Jung's psychotherapeutic approach, as well as his theory of religion, is another denizen of the collective unconscious, archetypes. It is, as it turns out, remarkably difficult to say what archetypes are, but it is important to try. Archetypes are ideas, or more specifically, archetype forms are predispositions to generate ideas or images. Jung's word of the word form is deliberate here, reminding us of Plato's use of the word. For Plato, the forms are the essences of perceptible things, and full knowledge of things requires knowledge of the forms themselves. Furthermore, for Plato, our souls have pre-existing knowledge of the forms gained before we had bodies. Jung himself is much more coy about whether the archetype forms exist outside of the collective unconscious too, whether they are real in the sense that Plato's forms certainly are real, even more real than their physical manifestations. But never mind that for now. It is totally unclear how many archetypes there are meant to be for Jung, and how any given form is related to any given other form. But everyone agrees about what the most important forms are. These are the persona, which is the image of ourselves we want to project to others, the shadow, the truths about ourselves we want to remain hidden, the anima and animus, which are the masculine and feminine sides of our personalities, the self proper, and God. The self is our true self, as it were. And as we shall see next week, we are driven to seek this true self hidden from our consciousness in the collective unconscious. But the archetype of the self, though formally distinct from the archetype of God, is nevertheless empirically identical to it, so that it is always impossible to tell when an image or idea is coming from the one or the other. The ego is, per Freud, the conscious and volitional part of our psyches. And this ego, our conscious selves, if you like, is constantly drawing from the unconscious, including from these archetypes. And it is also constantly, as just mentioned, seeking the self, seeking to be reconciled to it. Now, again, like Freud, the elements of our psyches can come into conflict. Most obviously, our persona, our public selves, can conflict with our shadow, our dark selves. Our masculinity and femininity can clash. Our conscious selves can obviously clash with any element of our unconscious. And as with Freud, these clashes are sources of neuroses. But unlike Freud, Jung does not always seek to banish any particular mental object. There are, he argues, other ways to resolve conflict than exile. I realize that this is quite a lot to digest. Fortunately, you need not worry too much about the finer details to understand the theories of religion of Freud and Jung. The critical difference to remember is that for Freud, the unconscious is the home of the repressed and repressed trauma in particular, and that for Jung, it is also, and most importantly, the home of the archetypes. Now, Jung's and Freud's ideas seem very far removed from anything else we have encountered so far, but there are threads to be encountered even here. They are connected to each other, obviously, but this business of archetypes that may or may not correspond to something real is reminiscent also of Aquinas and Calvin on one hand, and Mircea Eliade on the other. Like Aquinas and Calvin, Jung posits something innate to the mind that points to a transcendent reality. This is no coincidence. Aquinas more than Calvin, to be sure, but medieval and early modern Christian theologians are unmistakably indebted to Plato, especially via St. Augustine, and as we have seen, Jung is as well. The Eliade connection is also quite direct, though the direction is reversed. Eliade is the one influenced by Jung rather than vice versa. Freud's influences are more difficult to trace, as we will leave that for next week when we consider his theory in greater detail. Finally, a brief note on method. Jung and Freud may be described as erudite clinicians. The clinical part is straightforward. They spent a lot of their time seeing and analyzing patients. A good deal of this is spent probing the unconscious of their patients, not least by the interpretation of their dreams. The task of the clinician to Jung and Freud was to figure out what the images in these dreams mean. And this is where the erudition comes in. To aid him in the interpretation of dreams, Jung read copious amounts of mythology from around the world, and he would very often recognize motifs shared between his patients' dreams and something mentioned in some myth from such and such a culture. He would, like his Victorian forebears, also see connections across cultures. There is no methodological system that tells him when there is a real connection rather than a spurious one, which is the main problem with this method. He intuits these connections, which are sometimes really quite tenuous. From his clinical experience, he weaves together a theory of religion in general. And as what we shall see next week, Freud does something very similar, though his is perhaps a more principled method. And Freud's erudition has less to do with the reading of myths and legends from around the world than indeed in reading scientists writing at the time, as is Freud's wont, having been trained as a physician. We shall leave it here tonight for Jung and Freud, but pick up on their theories of religion per se next time. You won't, I hope, have to remember a lot of this information tonight. It's all very unfamiliar, I think, because it's a little bizarre, and so I don't expect anybody to remember any of this next week. But so I think I'll do a little recap before we get on to their theories per se. But I think we should get to questions now. If you have any questions, do type them into the chat box. And if you prefer to just speak out loud, you may unmute yourselves and speak. And I think your faces will appear on my screen automatically. So let's get out of these slides. There we are. Right. I see that Mike Truman has said, the theories of religion that have arisen all seem to be totally enmeshed in their culture, colonialism and modernism for this session. It does suggest that they're entirely contingent. So this is a deliberate framing on my part. I'm quite keen to make the point that these theories, and I think this is true also for scientific theories more generally, actually, but that theories are like any other intellectual effort or project, a proper part of any given culture. So this is partly why I like to say where the ideas come from and how they're shaped by the cultural, social, and political context of their time. I do want to say this. I don't think this is unique to social scientific theories. I think this is also true for theories in physics, for example. So for example, we talked about Hume a lot in these lectures, in part because I love Hume. But very famously, Einstein credits his theory of relativity, both general and specific, to his reading of Hume's treatise on human nature. And had he not, and he says himself, had he not read Hume and read, for example, only Kant, which is the other dominant figure on this point, he would have assumed that time was a kind of universally fixed entity. But it turns out he did read Hume, and he read Hume because he had 3 or 4 friends, one of whom was a philosopher, and they read philosophy together, sometimes getting very drunk while doing so. And so in a sense, that is extremely sort of autobiographically contingent, right? Like the idea that Einstein would not have come up with the theory of relativity had he not read Hume is sort of scary to philosophers of science who think, oh, but surely eventually someone would have discovered relativity. It's not obvious that that's true. So I think all theories are contingent either autobiographically, contingent upon what you happen to read, but also in terms of the social historical, political and societal context. And this is more obvious in some cases. I think it's more obvious in the social scientific case than it is in the physics and chemistry cases. But I think it's true in general, which is not to say I think that that this is a way to kind of criticize science, either social science or the physical sciences, because as it were, the proof is in the pudding, right? So wherever these ideas come from, as long as you can provide evidence for your theory, then you're good to go. And the scientific method in that sense really kicks in at the stage of verification or falsification, not at the stage of coming up with ideas. I mean, people come up with ideas in all kinds of ways. There's a famous story about the guy who discovered the structure of benzene, that sort of flammable material. And he writes in his diaries that what happened was he was sort of daydreaming in his gentleman's quarters in Ghent, and he had sort of daydreamed of the Ouroboros, the snake biting its own tail, and immediately he went, aha, the structure of benzene must be a ring, and he had no real reason to believe this, but off he went to the lab, and it turned out that he was right. So I'm sure it's true that daydreaming about snakes biting their own tails is an extremely unreliable and highly contingent way of coming up with chemical structures, but that's not the point. Right. The point is that he went to the lab and provided some evidence for his newfound theory.
Can I just? I accept that. Except that you're then saying that scientific method is exempt from being a product of a culture, and I'm not. While I would mostly want to agree with that, I'm not entirely sure that it's always exempt from being part of culture. I'm not sure that I can go much further than that, but I still feel there's a bit of a danger in assuming that scientific method and the scientific approach to things, which is such a dominant part of our culture, it's a bit like the water that we're swimming in as fish, and we can't necessarily see that, I don't know, in 200 years, we may be looking at that in a different way.
I think that's right too. I think that's right too. And I say something about this in the fifth lecture, where I talk about what we mean, what scientists mean when we say that we're measuring something, and how we know the measures are any good, right? And what I end up arguing in the fifth lecture is that we take a kind of pragmatic approach, right? So I think it goes slightly too far. And philosophers of science have thought about this for at least 50 years. And in some ways, the kind of early mid 20th century philosophers of science, these sort of original European philosophers of science, were themselves skeptical about the universality of science as a method, and therefore shied away from linking science too closely to metaphysics. They wanted to say, look, science is useful, but we don't know whether or not the deliberations of science are true. And so the earlier philosophers of science, whom we now call logical positivists, didn't want to do metaphysics at all. All they allowed themselves to say was, we know when the theory is useful. God only knows whether or not it's true. Oh, my Zoom, something has popped up on Zoom. Am I still here? Oh, excellent. Some weird thing popped up on Zoom saying that I signed out of a device, but I think we're okay. So I ended up arguing in the fifth lecture that my approach to measurement is a pragmatic one. But I think the same thing can be said about science more generally, is that you can make a pragmatic claim about what science does without then wanting to go to say that such and such theory is true. And in 21st century philosophy of science, you still have defenders of this kind of pragmatism, right? To say, okay, the most we can say about scientific theory is that it's reasonable or that it's useful or something like this, rather than saying that's true. Any other questions about the sort of cognitive aspects of theories of religion? Hear a message, but I don't see where it's coming from. Oh, no, there we are. It's not this app. Right. Well, it was very good to speak to you again. Next week, we will have functionalist theories of religion. We will begin again with Jung and Freud. And if anything, their theories of religion are even more bizarre than the theories of the mind more generally, as some of you might know a little bit about already. Then we will go through Feuerbach, and then Malinowski, who's an anthropologist, Ernest Becker, who's also an anthropologist, and finally Durkheim, and a little tiny bit on Marx. I don't love doing the Marx bit because he doesn't really have a theory of religion, but because everybody thinks he has a theory of religion, one is obliged to say something about Marx then. So next week, functionalist theories of religion, and then the week after, we get to what I think of as the scientific study of religion proper. We get to the late 20th and early 21st century, and so that's where we'll talk about measurement and manipulation, what the scientific study of religion looks like now. And so I will see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.